when the stranger sitting in seat 12 smiled at me through the rearview mirror, and I caught the glint of silver around her neck. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly drove my greyhound off Route 66, because hanging from her delicate chain was the exact same butterfly necklace my sister Diane had been wearing the night she disappeared 43 years ago. And in that moment, I knew that sometimes the people we've spent half our lives searching for find us exactly when we've given up hope of ever seeing them again. If you believe that some mysteries are meant to be solved by forces greater than coincidence, and that love can survive decades of separation and heartbreak, then you're going to want to hear every single word of what happened during the most extraordinary day of my 26-year career, driving cross-country routes for American bus lines. My name is Robert Chen, and I'm 68 years old, which means I should probably be thinking about retirement instead of still climbing behind the wheel of a 40-foot vehicle and crossing the American Southwest 6 days a week. But driving these routes has become more than just a job for me over the past 2.5 decades. It's become a pilgrimage, a search, a way of staying connected to every highway and truck stop and small town where my sister might have ended up after she walked out of our family home in Flagstaff, Arizona on March 8, 1981, telling our parents she was going to the corner market for milk and bread and never returning home again. She was 22 years old then, the same age I am now in my memories, frozen in time with her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and that butterfly necklace our grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday, the one she wore every single day because she said it reminded her that beautiful things could fly away, but they always knew how to find their way home when the time was right. The police searched for 6 months, following leads that took them from Phoenix to Los Angeles to Seattle, interviewing hundreds of people who claimed to have seen a young Asian woman matching Diane's description, but every single lead turned out to be someone else's sister, someone else's daughter, someone else's missing piece of the puzzle that never quite fit together the way our family needed it to. Our parents spent their life savings hiring private investigators who promised results they couldn't deliver, and eventually the case went cold, filed away in some drawer where unsolved mysteries go to gather dust, while the families left behind try to figure out how to keep living when part of their heart has been ripped away and scattered to places they can't even imagine. I became a bus driver because it gave me access to routes that cross state lines, because it put me in contact with thousands of passengers every year, because somewhere in the back of my mind I always believed that one day Diane would step onto my bus and we'd have the reunion that I'd been rehearsing in my mind for 4 decades. Every woman between the ages of 50 and 70 who climbed aboard got a second look from me. Every face was compared to the mental image I carried of what my sister might look like after all these years. Every passenger became a possibility that this might finally be the day when my searching would come to an end and my real life could begin again. But this Tuesday morning in November, when I pulled into the bus station in Albuquerque for our scheduled 15-minute rest stop, I wasn't thinking about Diane or missing persons or family mysteries that had consumed too many years of my life. I was thinking about the fact that my route was running 20 minutes behind schedule because of construction delays outside Amarillo, that my lower back was aching from 8 hours of highway driving, and that I had 14 passengers who were probably getting tired of the country music station that seemed to be the only thing coming through clearly on the radio in this part of New Mexico. The last thing I expected was for a woman to approach the bus with the kind of hesitant, almost fearful expression that suggested she was running from something rather than traveling toward something. Carrying nothing but a small canvas bag and wearing clothes that looked like she'd been living in them for several days. She was probably in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair that had once been black and eyes that held the kind of deep sadness that comes from carrying secrets too heavy to share with strangers. When she asked me if there was room for one more passenger heading toward Los Angeles, her voice was barely above a whisper, like someone who'd gotten out of the habit of speaking up for herself or asking for things she needed. I told her we had plenty of empty seats, that the fare was $87 if she was paying cash, and that we'd be pulling out in about 10 minutes if she wanted to grab something from the vending machines before we hit the road again. "Thank you," she said, handing me exact change that she'd apparently been counting and recounting in her pocket, and there was something about the way she said those 2 words that made me look at her more carefully. It wasn't just gratitude for transportation, it was gratitude for basic human kindness, the kind of thanks that comes from someone who hasn't experienced much compassion lately and isn't entirely sure she deserves it even now. She chose a seat near the back of the bus, settling in by the window with her small bag clutched in her lap, like it contained everything important she had left in the world. As we pulled back onto Route 66 and started the long stretch toward Gallup, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than usual, not because I suspected this woman of being my sister, but because something about her seemed familiar in a way that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the way she held her shoulders, or the careful way she observed everything around her, without making eye contact with the other passengers, or maybe it was just the loneliness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from pavement, the kind of isolation that I recognized because I'd been carrying my own version of it for most of my adult life. About an hour into the drive, somewhere between Gallup and Flagstaff, she moved from her seat in the back to an empty row closer to the front, and that's when I got my first clear look at her in the mirror. She was reading a paperback novel, something with a worn cover that suggested she'd read it multiple times before, and when she looked up from the page and our eyes met in the reflection, she gave me a small, tentative smile that made my chest tighten with recognition I couldn't quite place. But it was what I saw around her neck that made me nearly swerve off the highway and into the desert scrub that lined both sides of the route, because hanging from a delicate silver chain was a butterfly pendant that was absolutely identical to the one my sister had been wearing the last time I saw her alive. The butterfly necklace was catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bus windows, and every time it moved, I felt like I was seeing a ghost, because that particular piece of jewelry wasn't something you could buy at any department store or jewelry shop. It was a one-of-a-kind creation that our grandmother had commissioned from a local silversmith in Flagstaff back in 1975, designed specifically for Diane's 16th birthday, with intricate details that included tiny turquoise stones embedded in the butterfly's wings, and our family initials engraved so small on the back that you needed a magnifying glass to read them clearly. I knew every curve and line of that necklace because I'd helped our grandmother design it, because I'd saved up my allowance money for 3 months to help pay for it, because I'd been there when she opened the gift box and cried with joy at having something so beautiful and personal that no one else in the entire world would ever own anything exactly like it. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to pull over at the next rest area, telling my passengers that we were taking an unscheduled break so I could check on some engine trouble that I was pretty sure was just my imagination running wild, and my heart beating so fast that I could barely think straight. As everyone filed off the bus to stretch their legs and use the facilities, the woman with the necklace remained in her seat, looking out the window at the desert landscape with an expression that seemed both peaceful and profoundly sad. I knew I had to talk to her, had to find out how she'd come to possess something that belonged to my missing sister, but I also knew that approaching her with accusations or demands would probably scare her away before I could learn anything useful about where the necklace had come from or how long she'd had it. "Excuse me, miss," I said, walking back to where she was sitting and trying to keep my voice as calm and non-threatening as possible, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab the necklace and demand answers about where she'd gotten it and what had happened to the woman who'd been wearing it when she disappeared from my life 4 decades ago. "I don't mean to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing your necklace, and I wanted to tell you how beautiful it is. That's some really exceptional silver work, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see very often anymore." She looked down at the butterfly pendant, touching it gently with fingers that trembled slightly, and for a moment I thought she was going to ignore my comment or tell me to mind my own business. But instead she looked up at me with eyes that were filling with tears, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that she was obviously struggling to control. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It was a gift from someone very special to me, someone I lost a long time ago. I've worn it every day for over 40 years, and sometimes it's the only thing that makes me feel like she's still with me somehow." The words hit me like a physical blow, because if this woman had been wearing Diane's necklace for 40 years, it meant she'd either known my sister personally or had somehow acquired the jewelry after whatever had happened to Diane during those first few weeks after her disappearance. I sat down in the empty seat across the aisle from her, trying to figure out how to ask the questions I needed answers to without sounding like a crazy person or someone who might be dangerous to a woman traveling alone who clearly had her own complicated story to tell. "I'm sorry if this sounds strange," I said carefully, "but that necklace looks exactly like one that belonged to someone I used to know, someone who disappeared a long time ago. I don't want to upset you or make you uncomfortable, but would you mind telling me where you got it? It's just that I've been looking for this person for most of my adult life, and seeing that butterfly pendant is bringing back a lot of memories that I thought I'd learned to live with." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the kind of intense attention that suggested she was trying to decide whether I was telling the truth or whether this was some kind of elaborate scam to separate her from something valuable. Finally, she reached up and unclasped the necklace, holding it out to me with hands that were shaking almost as badly as my own. "Look at the back," she said softly. "There should be some letters engraved there, so small you can barely see them. If this is really connected to someone you knew, you should be able to tell me what those letters are." I took the butterfly pendant with reverence that bordered on religious awe, turning it over and squinting at the tiny engraving that I hadn't seen in person for 4 decades, but that I'd never forgotten because it represented everything our family had been before Diane's disappearance tore us apart and left the rest of us trying to figure out how to be whole again. The letters were exactly what I expected them to be, exactly what they'd always been, exactly what proved that this was the same piece of jewelry that had disappeared along with my sister on that March night in 1981, DLC, our grandmother's initials, surrounded by a tiny heart that the silversmith had added as his own artistic flourish. "Diane Louise Chen," I whispered, and the woman across the aisle from me gasped like I'd just revealed the secret that she'd been carrying for longer than either of us wanted to calculate. "Those are my grandmother's initials, and Diane was my sister's name. My sister, who disappeared when she was 22 years old, who was wearing this exact necklace the last time anyone in our family saw her alive." The silence that followed my revelation was unlike anything I'd experienced in nearly 3 decades of professional driving. The kind of quiet that occurs when 2 people realize they're connected by a story that's bigger and more complicated than either of them had understood until that moment. She was staring at me with recognition dawning in her eyes, and I was staring back at her with the growing certainty that this wasn't just a woman who'd somehow acquired my sister's jewelry. This was someone who'd known Diane personally, who'd been part of her life during the years when she was missing from mine, who might finally be able to answer the questions that had haunted our entire family for 43 years. Now, before I continue with what happened next in this rest area in the middle of the New Mexico desert, I need to pause and talk directly to those of you who are listening to this story, because what I'm about to share with you represents the moment when everything I thought I knew about loss and hope and family was turned completely upside down. If you're still with me after everything we've been through together so far, if this story has reminded you of your own experiences with missing pieces of your heart, with searches that seemed hopeless, with the way that love can survive even decades of separation and uncertainty, then I know you understand that what happened next wasn't just about finding answers to old questions. It was about discovering that sometimes the people we think we've lost forever have been carrying pieces of us with them all along, waiting for the right moment to find their way back home. You know what touches me most about sharing these stories with all of you? It's not just that you listen, though that means the world to me. It's that you understand that these aren't just tales to pass the time. These are reminders that hope isn't foolish, that searching isn't pointless, that believing in reunions and second chances and the possibility that missing pieces can still find their way back to where they belong isn't naive, but actually one of the most courageous things any of us can do. Every time one of you takes the time to really hear these stories, you're affirming that connection matters, that families can be found in the most unexpected places, that love doesn't have expiration dates or mileage limits or statutes of limitations. If this story has stirred something in your heart, if it's reminded you of your own missing pieces or unexpected discoveries, I'd be honored if you'd consider joining our little family here by hitting that subscribe button. Not because I need the numbers, but because stories like this deserve to be shared with people who understand their true value, who recognize that hope and healing happen when we stop carrying our burdens alone and start sharing them with others who've walked similar paths. "My name is Linda Martinez," she said finally, her voice barely steady enough to form the words that I could see were costing her tremendous effort to speak aloud. "And 43 years ago, when I was 19 years old and working the night shift at a diner outside Phoenix, a young woman came in around 3 in the morning, soaking wet from a thunderstorm, with no money and no place to go, wearing this necklace and calling herself Diana instead of Diane, because she said she was trying to become someone new, someone who could disappear completely from a life that had become too painful to keep living. The revelation hit me like stepping off a cliff I hadn't seen coming, because everything I thought I knew about my sister's disappearance was suddenly shifting into new patterns that made sense in ways I'd never considered during 4 decades of searching and wondering and imagining worst-case scenarios that might explain why a happy, healthy 22-year-old woman would walk out of her family home and never return. Linda continued talking, her words coming faster now as though a dam had burst and 43 years of secrets were finally flowing freely towards someone who could understand their true significance. She stayed at the diner until my shift ended at 6 in the morning, drinking coffee and telling me about how she'd grown up in a family that loved her but didn't understand her, how her parents had expectations for her life that felt like a prison she couldn't escape from, how she'd been engaged to marry a man that her family approved of but who made her feel invisible and unimportant every time he looked at her. She said she'd been planning to leave for months, saving money from her job at the department store, preparing to start over somewhere else as someone else. But that night something had happened with her fiancé that made her realize she couldn't wait another day to get away from a life that was suffocating her slowly. I was listening to this story with a mixture of relief and heartbreak, because learning that Diane had left voluntarily, rather than being kidnapped or murdered, was the best possible news I could have received after 4 decades of fearing the worst. But understanding that she'd been so unhappy in our family, that running away seemed like her only option, was devastating in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. Linda reached across the aisle and took my hand, offering comfort to me while she continued sharing memories that she'd clearly been carrying alone for far too long. She asked me if I knew anyone who might need a roommate, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about her past or why she didn't want to stay in contact with her family, and it turned out that I did know someone like that. I was sharing an apartment with 2 other girls who worked at the diner, and we were barely scraping together enough money to pay rent every month, so having a 4th person to split expenses with seemed like a gift from heaven. Diana moved in with us that same day, and for the next 3 years we lived together like sisters, closer than sisters really, because we were family that we'd chosen for ourselves, rather than family that we'd been born into. The mental image of my sister living with roommates in Phoenix, while I was driving myself crazy with worry and guilt about losing her, was simultaneously wonderful and heartbreaking, because it meant she'd been safe and happy during at least some of the years when I'd been imagining her in danger, or worse. Linda seemed to understand what I was feeling, because she squeezed my hand tighter and continued her story with the kind of gentle honesty that told me she'd thought about this conversation many times over the years. Diana worked at a bakery during the day and took classes at the community college at night, studying to become a teacher because she said she wanted to spend her life helping children learn to think for themselves instead of just accepting what adults told them was right or wrong. She was funny and smart and kind, but she was also carrying a deep sadness about leaving her family behind, especially her younger brother, who she said had always been her best friend and favorite person in the world. She talked about you constantly, Robert, wondered how you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you'd forgiven her for leaving without saying goodbye. Hearing my name spoken in connection with memories of my sister was overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated, because it meant that even when she was building a new life, under a new name, in a new city, she'd been thinking about me, missing me, caring about my well-being in the same way I'd been worrying about hers during all those years of searching and wondering and hoping for news that never came. What happened to her? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know why Linda was telling me this story in the past tense, why she was wearing Diane's necklace instead of my sister wearing it herself, why this reunion I'd been imagining for 43 years was happening with someone else instead of with the person I'd been searching for all this time. Linda was quiet for a long moment, looking out the bus window at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with grief that time hadn't diminished or healed completely. Diana got sick in 1984, about 3 years after she'd moved in with us. It started with headaches and fatigue that we all thought were just stress from work and school, but it got worse quickly, and by the time the doctors figured out what was wrong, the cancer had spread too far for treatment to make much difference. She lived for about 6 months after the diagnosis, and during that time she made me promise 2 things that I've spent the rest of my life trying to honor. The word cancer hit me like a physical blow, because it meant that even if I'd somehow found Diane during those years, when she was living in Phoenix, Even if our family had been reunited during the early 1980s, we still would have lost her to something that had nothing to do with her choice to leave home or start over somewhere else. Linda continued talking, sharing details that I needed to hear, even though each word was making the loss more real and more final than it had ever seemed during 4 decades of hoping she might still be alive somewhere. The first thing she made me promise was that I would wear her necklace and think of her every day, that I would carry part of her with me wherever I went so that she wouldn't be completely gone as long as someone still remembered how much she loved beautiful things and how much she believed that people should be free to choose their own paths in life, even when those choices hurt the people who loved them most. The second promise was harder, and it's the reason I've never tried to contact your family, even though Diana talked about you and your parents constantly during those last months. I braced myself for whatever Linda was about to tell me, because I could see in her expression that this second promise had been weighing on her for 40 years, that it represented a burden she'd been carrying alone since my sister's death, and that sharing it with me was going to be painful for both of us in different ways. She made me promise that I wouldn't tell your family what had happened to her unless one of you found me first, unless the universe somehow brought us together in a way that felt like more than just coincidence. She said she didn't want your parents to spend the rest of their lives blaming themselves for her unhappiness, didn't want you to carry guilt about not being able to save her from something that was beyond anyone's control. She wanted your family to remember her as someone who'd chosen to leave, rather than as someone who'd been taken away by circumstances that no one could have predicted or prevented. The weight of understanding what my sister had been trying to protect us from, even in her final months, was almost more than I could process while sitting in a bus, parked at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by other travelers who had no idea that the conversation happening in seats 14 and 15 was reshaping everything I'd believed about love, loss, and the sometimes impossible choices that families make for each other, even when those choices cause decades of pain and confusion. Linda reached into her small canvas bag and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled carefully for many years, the kind of precious cargo that gets moved from place to place but never really unpacked, because opening it means confronting emotions that are too big to examine closely. Diana spent her last weeks writing letters that she never intended to send, trying to explain her choices to your family, trying to find words that would help you understand why she'd felt like she had no choice but to disappear completely rather than live a life that felt like slow suffocation. She gave them to me right before she died, along with some photographs and other things that she'd saved from her childhood, and made me promise to hold on to them until I found a way to get them to you that felt right, that felt like something she would have approved of, rather than just a cruel reminder of everything your family had lost. I took the envelope with hands that were shaking too badly to open it immediately, because I knew that whatever was inside represented the final communication from my sister, the explanation I'd been waiting 43 years to receive, the closure that our entire family had needed, but had never been able to find through police investigations or private detectives, or the hundreds of sleepless nights we'd spent wondering what had happened to her and whether our love had somehow failed to be enough to keep her safe and happy. Before you read those letters, Linda continued, there's something else you need to know about Diana's last months. Something that might help you understand why she was so determined to protect your family from the truth about what had happened to her. During those final weeks, when the pain medications made it possible for her to talk without too much discomfort, she told me about the night she left home, about what had finally pushed her to walk away from people she loved more than her own life. I settled back in my seat, preparing myself for revelations that I suspected were going to be difficult to hear, but necessary for understanding the complete truth about my sister's disappearance and the choices she'd made that had affected our entire family for 4 decades. Linda took a deep breath, gathering courage for sharing secrets that she'd been keeping since 1984. Secrets that had shaped her own life in ways that were only now becoming clear to both of us. Diana told me that your parents had arranged her engagement to David Morrison without really asking what she wanted, that they'd been pressuring her for months to set a wedding date and start planning a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. She said David was a good man in many ways, successful and reliable, and approved of by everyone in your community, but that being with him made her feel like she was disappearing a little more every day, becoming the kind of woman that other people expected her to be, instead of the person she actually was inside. The name David Morrison brought back memories that I'd buried for 40 years, because I remembered him as one of the most boring, conventional, predictable men I'd ever met. Someone who'd seemed completely wrong for my creative, independent, free-spirited sister, but who'd won our parents' approval because he had a stable job and traditional values, and the kind of bland reliability that they'd mistaken for husband material. Linda continued her story, revealing details about that final night that I'd never heard from anyone else in our family. The night she left, Diana had gone to dinner with David and your parents to discuss wedding plans, and something happened during that conversation that made her realize she couldn't keep pretending to be happy about a future that felt like a prison sentence she hadn't chosen for herself. David had apparently made some comment about how wives shouldn't work outside the home after they had children, how Diana would need to give up her job at the department store and her dream of becoming a teacher so she could focus on being a proper wife and mother to the family they were going to build together. I could imagine my sister's reaction to that kind of casual dismissal of her dreams and ambitions, because even as teenagers, we'd talked about how she wanted to make a difference in the world, how she believed that education was the key to helping people think for themselves and make choices based on their own values, rather than just accepting what society expected of them. Linda's story was filling in gaps in my understanding that I'd never even known existed. When Diana tried to explain that she'd always planned to keep working after marriage, that teaching was important to her, and that she thought they could build a partnership where both of them pursued their own goals while supporting each other's dreams, David laughed at her like she'd said something childish and naive. He told her that her little fantasies about having a career would disappear once she started having babies and discovered what really mattered in life, and your parents apparently agreed with him, saying that Diana would understand the importance of traditional family roles once she matured and stopped being so selfish about wanting everything her own way. The picture Linda was painting of that final dinner was making me understand my sister's desperation in ways that I'd never considered during 4 decades of wondering why she'd left our family behind, because it wasn't really our family she'd been running from. It was the suffocating expectations and the dismissive attitudes and the complete inability of the people who claimed to love her to actually listen to what she was telling them about who she was and what she needed to be happy. Diana said she sat there listening to 3 people she loved plan out her entire future without once asking what she wanted, watching them divide up her dreams and ambitions like wedding cake that could be discarded once the real celebration began. She told me that in that moment, she realized that staying meant spending the rest of her life pretending to be grateful for a life that would slowly kill everything authentic and creative and independent about her personality, and leaving meant breaking the hearts of people she loved, but preserving the part of herself that made her feel like a real person, instead of just a role that other people wanted her to play. Linda reached over and opened the manila envelope, pulling out a stack of letters tied with a ribbon that had faded from red to pink over the decades, along with several photographs that I recognized immediately as pictures from our childhood, images of family vacations and birthday parties, and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable when they were happening, but that had become precious beyond measure after Diane's disappearance, made us realize how many memories we'd taken for granted. "She wrote you 17 letters over those final 6 months," Linda said softly, handing me the stack of correspondence that represented my sister's final attempt to bridge the gap between the life she'd chosen and the family she'd left behind. Some of them are explanations, some are apologies, some are just stories about her life in Phoenix and the people she'd met and the things she'd learned about herself after she finally had the freedom to figure out who she really was when no one else was making decisions for her. I untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, knowing that reading these letters was going to be both the greatest gift and the most heartbreaking experience of my life, because they represented the voice of my sister speaking directly to me across 4 decades of silence, offering the connection I'd been desperately missing while also confirming that she was truly gone and would never be able to speak to me in person again. The first letter was dated December 15th, 1984, just 2 months before Diana died, and her handwriting was shaky from the medications, but still unmistakably hers, still carrying the same loops and curves that I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists and the 100 small notes we'd passed back and forth during our childhood, when we'd wanted to communicate something too important or too silly to say out loud in front of our parents. Reading her words after 43 years of silence was like hearing her voice again, like having her sitting right there beside me, explaining everything I'd never understood about her choices and her dreams and her love for a family that she'd had to leave behind in order to save herself from disappearing completely. "My dearest Robert," the letter began, "if Linda is reading this letter to you, it means that somehow the universe has brought you two together in exactly the way I hoped it would, and it means that you're finally going to learn what really happened to me after I walked out of our house on that March night in 1981. I need you to know before I tell you anything else that leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, that I never stopped missing you or Mom and Dad, that there hasn't been a single day in the past 3 years when I haven't wondered if I made the right choice, or if there might have been some other way to solve the problems that made staying feel impossible." I had to stop reading for a moment because the tears were making it difficult to see the words clearly, and Linda reached over to offer me tissues from her bag while she waited patiently for me to compose myself enough to continue learning about my sister's final thoughts and feelings. When I could focus again, I continued reading words that felt like they were healing wounds I'd carried for most of my adult life. "I want you to understand that when I left home, I wasn't running away from love. I was running toward the possibility of becoming the person I really was, instead of the person everyone else wanted me to be. David Morrison was a good man in many ways, but marrying him would have meant giving up everything that made me feel alive and creative and independent, and I knew that if I stayed and went through with that wedding, I would slowly turn into someone who resented everything about her life. Someone bitter and disappointed, and angry at everyone around her for not recognizing that she'd had dreams and ambitions that mattered just as much as anyone else's." The letter continued for 3 pages, describing Diana's life in Phoenix, her work at the bakery, her classes at the community college, her friendships with Linda and the other women who'd become her chosen family during those years when she was discovering who she could be, when she had the freedom to make her own choices about everything from career goals to daily schedules to the kind of person she wanted to love and be loved by in return. "I know that my disappearance has caused tremendous pain for our family," she wrote near the end of that first letter, "and I know that you've probably spent years wondering if there was something you could have done differently, some way you could have saved me from whatever terrible fate you've been imagining. But I need you to understand that you did save me, Robert, just by being the kind of brother who always listened to my dreams and never made me feel stupid or selfish for wanting more than what other people thought should be enough for someone like me. Knowing that you believed in me gave me the courage to believe in myself, and that belief is what made it possible for me to build a life that felt authentic and meaningful, even when it meant living far away from the people who loved me most." Linda had been reading along silently as I worked my way through Diana's words, and when I finished the first letter, she handed me another one that was dated just 3 weeks later, showing how my sister's handwriting had deteriorated as her illness progressed, but how her determination to communicate with me had remained strong despite the physical challenges she was facing. "I've been thinking about Christmas," the second letter began, "and remembering how we used to stay up late on Christmas Eve, trying to figure out what presents Mom and Dad had hidden in the closet, how we'd whisper and giggle and make plans for staying awake long enough to see Santa Claus, even though we were probably too old to really believe in him anymore. Those are some of my happiest memories, Robert. Those times when it was just you and me conspiring together, when we were allies in the great adventure of growing up in a family that loved us, but didn't always understand us." As I read through letter after letter, a complete picture of my sister's final years began to emerge, and it was nothing like the tragic story I'd been imagining for 4 decades. Diana had found love with a man named Carlos, who worked as a carpenter and wrote poetry in his spare time, someone who'd encouraged her dreams of becoming a teacher and had been planning to marry her before she got sick. She'd been accepted into a program that would have allowed her to earn her teaching degree while working part-time at the bakery, and she'd been saving money to buy a small house where she and Carlos could build the kind of life that was based on mutual respect and shared dreams, rather than traditional expectations that felt like limitations. "The cancer diagnosis was devastating," she wrote in a letter dated January 1985, "not because I was afraid of dying, but because I was finally happy, finally living the life I'd always dreamed of, finally becoming the person I was meant to be, and I didn't want to leave all of that behind just when everything was falling into place. But I've made peace with what's happening to me, and I want you to make peace with it too, Because my 3 years in Phoenix were worth more than a lifetime of pretending to be someone else would have been. The final letter was the shortest and the most difficult to read, written in handwriting that was barely legible, but filled with love and hope, and the kind of wisdom that sometimes comes to people who are facing the end of their lives with courage and grace. "My time is running out," Diana had written, "but I'm not afraid anymore because I know that love doesn't end when life ends, that the connections we make with the people who matter most to us continue in ways we can't always see or understand. Linda has promised to find a way to get these letters to you when the time is right, and I trust her to know when that moment arrives. Until then, please remember that every choice I made was about trying to live authentically rather than safely, about choosing love and creativity and independence over security and approval, and the kind of conventional happiness that works for some people but would have been poison for someone like me." Linda and I sat in silence for a long time after I finished reading, both of us processing emotions that were too complex to put into words, both of us understanding that this moment represented the end of one story and the beginning of another. Finally, she spoke quietly about the years since Diana's death, about how she'd carried my sister's memory and necklace with her through a life that had included marriage, divorce, children, grandchildren, and eventually the kind of loneliness that had led her to board a Greyhound bus with no particular destination in mind, just a need to keep moving until she found whatever she was supposed to find next. "I never had children of my own," Linda said, "but Diana was like a sister to me for those 3 years, and after she died I felt responsible for keeping her memory alive, for making sure that her story didn't just disappear with her. I've thought about contacting your family hundreds of times over the years, but I kept remembering her second promise, her insistence that you should only learn the truth if we found each other naturally, rather than through my deliberate efforts to track you down." I looked at this woman who'd been carrying my sister's final messages for 40 years, who'd worn Diana's necklace every single day as a way of honoring a friendship that had meant everything to both of them, and I realized that she'd been as much a prisoner of my sister's death as I'd been, bound by promises that had protected our family from certain kinds of pain while creating other kinds of suffering that had lasted for decades. "Linda," I said finally, "I want you to know that meeting you today, learning the truth about what happened to Diana, getting to read her letters and understand her choices, has been the greatest gift I could ever have received. But I also want you to know that your promise to her is fulfilled now, that you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore, that you're part of our family story whether you expected to be or not." As our bus pulled back onto Route 66 and continued toward Los Angeles, Linda and I spent the remaining hours of the journey sharing memories of Diana from our different perspectives, creating a more complete picture of who she'd been during both the years when she'd lived with our family and the years when she'd been building a new life in Phoenix. By the time we reached the LA bus terminal, we'd exchanged phone numbers and addresses, made plans for Linda to meet my parents who were still alive and living in a retirement community in Tucson, and begun the process of weaving together the pieces of a story that had been scattered for 4 decades. Today, 3 years after that encounter on Route 66, Linda has become the sister I never had, the keeper of Diana's memory, who helps our family understand that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, that sometimes caring for someone means letting them go even when keeping them close would be easier and less painful. We talk every week, sharing stories and memories and the kind of ordinary family news that Diana would have wanted to hear if she'd been able to stay in touch during those final years of her life. And here's what I want you to understand as we come to the end of this story. Every single moment that led to Linda and me finding each other on that bus was the result of choices that ordinary people made about kindness, about honesty, about the courage to honor difficult promises, even when keeping them meant carrying heavy burdens alone for decades. Linda could have thrown away Diana's letters, could have sold the necklace, could have decided that a promise made to a dying friend was too painful to keep honoring after so many years. I could have chosen a different career, could have given up searching for my sister, could have decided that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But we both chose to keep believing that love creates connections that can survive anything, that families can be found and formed and reformed in the most unexpected ways, that hope isn't foolish even when it takes 43 years to be rewarded. If this story has moved you the way it's moved me, if it's reminded you of your own experiences with loss and love, and the unexpected ways that people find their way back to each other, I'd be deeply honored if you'd become part of our community here. Not just as a subscriber, but as someone who believes that sharing these stories makes all of us a little less alone in a world that can sometimes feel too big and too cold for the kind of hope that keeps us searching for missing pieces of our hearts. Tell us in the comments about your own experiences with unexpected reunions, with promises kept across decades, with the ways that strangers have become family in your life. Share your stories of lost and found, of love that survives separation, of the mysterious ways that the universe sometimes brings exactly the right people together at exactly the right moment. Your stories matter just as much as mine, and hearing them reminds all of us that we're part of something bigger than our individual experiences, part of a human family that's connected by love and loss and the courage to keep believing in possibilities that seem impossible until they actually happen.